Greetings, Marsh here, and welcome to episode 273 of my modded Factorio playthrough. In this episode, we are going to finish up with steel coils. Enjoy. Alright, now we have the important one here. Steel. Let's just pull all of this out. Looks like some of the power got disconnected here. I don't know how much it really matters, but those are LTN stations. So we probably want to make sure that it stays connected. So we need to go through the same logic of determining how we want to make steel based on what we did with iron here. Looking at all of the possible ways of making it. Well, we'd want to use the better way of making the coils from the coolant, which requires the molten steel. And then we get up to 5 options of it. The direct way, just doing the steel ingots. One which we mix in silicon to make double the output, and that is almost certainly worth it because since steel requires 4 units of input to create, but to make a silicon or anything else you only need 1 ore, that it's probably pretty smart to be pulling off of silicon to require way less iron. And we could do the same with manganese. Manganese is a byproduct, but even if silicon wasn't overloaded, we'd almost still want to do it that way, just to minimize the amount of iron we're using. But we're probably going to have a ton of manganese on hand, and you can see that we're up to 42,000 now, because we're prioritizing making iron from the method that creates manganese, and that is definitely working at creating a huge overload of it, and it'll probably get maxed out, and that's actually fine, because we want it to be that way. The only thing that wouldn't be able to run when it might want to would be this one on the end for the cobalt. But since it can't run anyway because of nickel, that probably won't matter. So we may never have to worry about using silicon. We can just use the manganese for that. And then there's the way that uses nickel and cobalt. So that's a great way of getting rid of the nickel, but it requires a cobalt. Oh, wow, a train. And then the final method, which we can't do, involves the use of tungsten. And since we can't even make that right now, that's probably not the smartest thing to do. So we're going to have 4 ways, and in fact it's going to be very similar to iron, just smaller in scale. We're going to have one central way of making just the steel, and then 2 methods on the outside that will add in manganese or silicon, and then something on the side which will also be very similar to this. So it's basically going to be identical. The only difference is the scale. So we want to limit this based on our ingot production, which is 30. And it doesn't want to seem to link correctly, but we could just make a judgment call here that it's going to be 1/4 the size because it's 1/4 the input, which means that we would basically need 1 machine rather than 4 for all of this. So despite it being rather similar, I kind of want to just rebuild it anyway, because the scale is going to be a lot smaller. And to get the correct numbers, we need the speed modules on everything. So it's going to be hilariously tiny by comparison. So we have our 2 machines, making the steel the old-fashioned way. It'll have 1 belt of steel coming in. Each machine we'll need about 15 of them, which is basically 2 inserters. Then we can have a second belt coming in here. Let's just say that's the silicon, because I think silicon is the one that we put on the end here. And they go twice as fast because it's an alloy, which means we only need the 1. Working on the silicon. We can quickly check our math here that this is consuming 36, and we'd want it to be doing 30. And it looks like this one is not, because the output is the same. So we definitely want it to be able to match. And although this is matching the output of 360 steel a second, so it is twice as fast, it's not necessarily using up all of the available steel. And since steel is something we produce so little of, we probably want to have the ability to use all of it if we can by using an alloy. So we kind of want to base this output based on the output of the alloys and not the main resource, which is different than how we had the other one set up. Since it is twice as fast, it needs twice as many inserters here. Some power poles in there, so the first inserters will pull off of the steel belt. The other two will pull off the silicon one. And then we'll need the necessary logic on there. But that gets that one lined up. Then we can put one on the other side. The bot winding has stopped. Is that because it's all caught up? Yeah, look at that. Of course, it only placed it where it could. So there's empty spots where they cannot, but that's okay. It kind of tells us where we still need to cover with robots. As the production is going, it looks like we're a little low on hydrofluoric acid, which is interesting. Wouldn't expect that to be the case. We've just got our one machine making it, so potentially that is what needs to be updated. Because I imagine it's getting sucked into... yeah, just making the Jivalite crystals here, probably for making cobalt. Otherwise, the rest of the factory is holding up as far as the acid resources. Because the minimum is 10,000, so anytime it goes below 10,000 is when something isn't running correctly. But that's just a single machine with no speed modules, so you know how it goes. Speed modules solve all problems. And probably going to need way more inserter than just that. So let's try this. A lot of these inserters probably need to be upgraded as well. And this liquefier could probably stand to be upgraded. Not going to worry about having them balanced with each other or anything. I just want to speed it up as much as is reasonable. So speed modules in there. And there we go. It is now caught up again. So acids are good. The ores are just limited. Specifically cobalt. It's running. It's just, it's all getting sucked away. Yep, completely empty. It hasn't quite made it down here yet. But how is the status of these? This is actually pretty good because these are about to hit 60 stacks, which is the size of the train. Which means that it will start backing up. So it looks like it just barely had enough buffer to get that done in a reasonable amount of time. But our stone is continuing to increase, so in fact we're not even consuming it with our concrete as fast as we are making it. Which means no guilt at all about using even more of it to keep the robots busy. So the next level seems to be right about here. So let's lag the computer. Give it a second. And keep going. Give it a second. It is a little monotonous doing it this way. I don't know, maybe there's a better way of doing it. But it's a heck of a lot easier than manually placing it by hand. So I don't mind doing it. I will put up with a little bit of lag and inconvenience for a few seconds so the robots can spend an hour placing all this concrete down. Oh wow, those are still loud. You can even hear it from the radar. I don't think I adjusted those yet. So I have to remember to do that for the arboretums. I think the reason why some of these are loud is that I was looking at the configuration files, and I think the some of the volume settings did change. So even the volume changes that I did ended up being not quite enough anymore because of just the way that the volume is calculated. So that's why some of these are still kind of obnoxiously loud, even though I'm technically lowering their volume already. It's just not by very much anymore. And let's give it one more pass, why not? Let's give the robots more work they can ever possibly have hope of completing. After all, a robot's worth in life is how much work gets done, so let's give them worth. Okay. And they're working away. I noticed that they're prioritizing putting the concrete in this one chest, but that's creating throughput limitations here. Because you can see how much more is actually available. So let's actually put a storehouse right here, asking for that concrete. And it basically always asks for it. And it looks kind of dumb, having a storage warehouse just going into a regular one. But the reason for that is logistics requests. Because down here, and in various other places, we're needing concrete for making things. Not so much with our mainline machines right now, but we do need it for some others, like making substations and power poles. So a problem occurs here if we have a setup like this, where we are supplying with a provider chest the concrete. Well, technically, if you have a storage chest that has that same thing, that will get priority over the passive provider. So instead of the robots just coming down here, grabbing the concrete and sending them where they need to go quickly, if we had a storage warehouse down here with concrete in it, they would fly all the way down here to go to this warehouse to get it and fly all the way back up. But we also need somewhere for the robots to drop the used concrete that we don't need anymore as we are replacing it in the factory, because there isn't enough room to place it anywhere else really, so it has to be placed back at the source. So we have this as a sort of a firewall where the robots come in, they place their resources here, and then they get placed into a non-logistics chest for them to be sent through the network. And then anything that does need to be on robots can be right there. And the concrete can take the normal path of using drones to get to where it needs to go. So that's kind of why I have the second thing here when it doesn't seem like we'd really need it. The robots are staying busy and charging away. So silicon is on the right, regular steel is in the middle. Let's have another set of two machines on this side, and of course they can just share the same pipe because they're making steel just the same. It's just their inputs are different. And it will need to have something like this where it can't share the belt like that side did, so it needs to have its own place here. One will be manganese and another one will be extra steel. We need another machine to handle potentially making it from cobalt, even though right now that is probably not something that is going to occur. It does give us an idea of input though. Oop, we need to set that to steel, not the iron. So there we go, our molten steel. And it uses 18 per machine, which is the same as these ones. But its output is higher because it's mixing it with other resources. So since our limiting factor is the steel, it means we also need to have two of them. So between the two of those, we're maxing out our 30 per second. It's going to be using two different resources, but it will still use the steel. So we can pull off of that side and then have two more belts coming in here. Two of them can be distance changing right there, and the other two just the regulars. And that should be what we need here. So let's get it placed. Then we can get the logic figured out. Another thing we need to worry about is this setup. But honestly, the width of the setup is probably going to be the same. It's just only going to require like 1 of each one of these instead of 3. Still require the cooling towers in that setup though. But I think we can assume that it will take up a similar amount of space. So if we look at this compared to our other setup here, it is narrower because of the less number of belts. And the cooling setup is slightly wider than this, so we have to keep that in mind when placing it. That we don't want to mash it right up there. So knowing that, we should probably place the cooling setup down first. Just so we know how big it's going to be. And then we'll just pull out all the stuff that's not getting used. So I think that would work. Because that's going to give us 2 spaces right here. And it's going to place a lot of stuff that doesn't need to be there anymore. But then we can place this as well. And line it up with here. And wherever makes sense. I can't really put it there because it would be in the way of the belts. So I think it has to be right there instead, and that would line up that pipe. And these belts wouldn't impact anything. So, the cobalt steel caught up, which is nice to see. It is still trying to work its way down here. And what is it filling up the bus with? Just kind of a little bit of junk. But I don't think any of it is really overloading us. It's kind of interesting now that manganese is at 60,000. So doing it this way is definitely going to like max out manganese, but I suppose a whole bunch of it will disappear because we could use half of it for production of iron, half of it for production of steel, half of it for production of aluminum, and also titanium. So once all those things are actually running, I think that's going to knock it down quite a bit. Okay, let's get the logic for this setup. We want to kind of do it similar to how we did this other setup here, where the alloy resources are limited on the belt based on the status of the warehouses. So they are 2 spaces down, so they would all be on those squares right there. And it might make it easier to figure out what goes where if we actually get these belts in place first. Okay, that should be the input resources here, so we can figure out the logic for it, which we can pull from over here. So we want to do it in a similar way, where with silicon, it only runs if the silicon is overloaded or at 60,000, and we could potentially change this to make it more likely to run, just because this ultimately saves resources. So knowing that, I almost want it to always run and not even have logic connected to it, just because it's almost certainly better to use a silicon rather than a steel, because only 1 silicon went into a silicon bar when 4 iron went into a steel. So it's almost certainly better to do that. Unfortunately, as efficient as using cobalt is, as long as we don't have a direct method of making it, it probably won't be viable. So we probably want to have something similar to this, where if either is overloaded, it will run both of them. And luckily they're the same resources, so nothing really needed to be changed. And it hooks it up because we are maxed out on nickel. And I guess we just won't hook up the cobalt, because we just don't want to use it for this process right now. And as far as using manganese, it's something we pretty much would always want to do, but manganese won't necessarily always be overloaded, because as good as using the manganese for steel is, it's not necessarily the best use of it. That the best use is probably titanium, because we make even less of that than we make steel right now. But it's a close second. So instead of always running, like it would with titanium, we'd probably want to have some minimum amount. So where this one is set to above 30, we'd probably want it to be like above 10. And if it is, it can run. And since we are, it wants to connect. And because silicon is such an easy thing to make, and it is so efficient, we won't even wait for silicon to be overloaded. That one will just always be hooked up as well. So now we need to control the outputs based on the status of this storage tank. But before we do that, let's come in here and change all this around. Because we probably now have way too much. Well, at best, we're going to make 360 a second if it's just from steel alone. But if it's from the bigger alloy, since the machines are faster, it will actually be 1080. So we want to base it on the fastest method, which would be this 1080. So how much does this use? Actually reasonably close. So actually knowing that, it's a little oversized, but not by much. And why tear off one machine here or there when we just don't need to? We can leave it the way it is and not even bother. That seems like the easier solution. And robots are continuing to place concrete absolutely everywhere. How is the acid doing? It's holding up just fine now. And we are continuing to build up stone, so we're just about at the point where we're going to start crystallizing some more again. But hey, it seems to be working. Nothing to complain about there. Well, one other thing I wanted to check up on is how are we doing on our mineral oil, and it seems like we're doing okay. Doesn't seem like fish has run very much, but it's only there as a backup in case we run out. But one thing I have noted is that all of these tanks we put here for our polluted fish water are completely full, so even if we wanted more fish, we wouldn't get it anyway. And these aren't super maxed out or anything. They're just running as best they can. But I actually did think of something we can do with the polluted fish water. So although we can't clarify it, which would be the easy way, if we just follow it down the chain of what's the whole point of polluted fish water to begin with? Well, it is to make crystals. And we have methods here of grinding the crystals away if we have too many. But what if we artificially turn this on just to get rid of that polluted fish water? What would happen? Well, all three of these would essentially be grinding crystals, or at least two of them. There's always the one that's the controlling factor, and it's the red, which makes sense since those are our productivity modules. The other two are kind of maxed out because they're not getting used as much. But essentially, if they're running, all three would dump their dust into this warehouse, which in itself would dump back into creating more crystals. So over time, this would get filled up, but crystals do not create enough dust on their own, so they require dust from an outside source, which is coming from this completely full warehouse, and these completely full things, and this completely full warehouse as well. So we would lessen the need of those completely full things by grinding some crystals away, and that would just make it disappear. And we could also technically grind these better crystals as well, but since those require more input resources, it's probably not worth doing. So once we get this steel hooked up, I kind of want to go down there and just get those crystals taken care of. But now that we know that all of this is a good healthy size, we can start getting it all hooked up. But like before, we can control which alloys are used based on the inputs of those alloyed resources. But we actually control which one gets priority based on the status of this tank and the inserters for working on steel. So one set needs none at all, and that is the very best way, which is dumping the nickel if it is available. And the logic would be quite similar to this side here, where doing it with cobalt always runs, and the next best way is with the silicon, which runs at 40,000. And that makes sense because we don't want anything on the ore bus to be overloaded. And between silicon and manganese, manganese could be overloaded. It would really only hurt us with making some amount of cobalt. It's basically a byproduct resource. It's just nice to have. So it's fine. It's the only resource on our bus that is actually fine to be overloaded. So it's probably more important to get rid of the silicon compared to the manganese. So as a result, we would set silicon to 40,000 and manganese to 30, and then the regular steel would be 20. So we would expect to see all of these on because we have nothing in there, and that seems to be the case. So we can sort of test this out by unhooking that and hooking all this up and see what happens. That we would expect to see all of it run, at least in the beginning. But then steel would shut off first right here, and then manganese would shut off, and finally the silicon would shut off. And it should fill up rather quickly. And it's not going to max out the belt because it's going to two different places here. And that makes sense because each one is set up for maxing out the belt in its entirety. So that is what we would expect to see. So we're above 10,000. When we get above 20, steel should shut off. And it does. And now it's going to silicon exclusively, and then when we get to 30,000, manganese will shut off. And it has. So then all of those ingots will now get sent towards silicon. And it's interesting that even as they shut off, the actual production speed doesn't, because it was always using the one belt to begin with. It was just getting diverted to different machines. But now silicon's going. It hits 40,000. And it shuts off. Awesome. Okay, well, we still need to get all of this other stuff hooked up. The coolant. And for once, it lined up without anything being in the way. So there we go, coolant's filling up. And probably need to grab even more filters. Hey, it actually is maxed out for once. So maybe we don't need more filters, but we probably still do, because we want to have a sufficient buffer in there. The occasional light would be nice. And might as well get the robots working on all of this junk for now. So it's going to take them a while to get down here. Okay, is everything mostly hooked up? Just about. Don't need this pipe here. Of course, inventory is full. But as long as they're marked, robots will take care of it. One thing, though, is we do need to move the train station. And it looks like we picked it up, but we never put it back down. Which means we can just kind of pick a nice place to put it. Like right there. This is only going to create one belt worth of resources, so we don't need to go crazy with any of this. Just want to make sure the robots can get to where they need to go. Cobalt steel plate load. Definitely want to get this one set up correctly. As steel coil load. You kind of need to make sure all these combinators are in place. Might as well get those set up now. Because if they're not, we might be getting some weird train requests. So let's get that minimally hooked up. The bots are coming down here to handle everything else. And they're cleaning out the inventory of junk. Which is nice. Might as well get that process started now, because there's quite a bit of it inside the crawler. They're really trying to help. And hopefully it's all not just getting placed in here. Well, so far it's empty, so I guess it isn't. Okay, it desperately wants its steel. And I think we've got enough here to test it out. So we'll hook up the pipe. And those are going, making our one belt of steel coils. And in reality, to make this, it would require 1260 of input, which wouldn't even come from this side, so we can never quite fill it out, but as long as we're using up all of our input, then we're doing as good as we can expect. Which is fine. And as this level goes down, it's using the more and more desperate methods of making stuff. So it's using both manganese and silicon. It does kind of break the logic slightly when these machines are faster than what's applying them, because then it means that the logic between using silicon before manganese doesn't really get applied. But oh well, it seems to be working. And as this level goes down, that output is going to slow down, which is okay. We do still need to hook up this road right here, and I'm not sure where the best place to do it would be, but the bus probably isn't going to go any farther than this, not that it really can. So maybe we should just run the road in from the other direction. I think we still have some road in here we can use. We could potentially move this as well if we need to, but also we probably don't. It is kind of going out of the way a little bit. And in fact, we might be able to remove this road by just sending this belt all the way down here, but whatever. The road's already there. Might as well continue to use it. But meanwhile, it seems like it's using the ingots well enough. There should still be some road left over, and it looks like there is, because we had a lot of that in buffer. And since this logic, because it's consuming it faster than it goes in, kind of doesn't care about how this is set up, I kind of want to just put the limiter in here for silicon, like we did with iron, where the ore has to be overloaded, or more than 60,000. It is more material efficient to use it, but this logic is kind of messed up by the fact that this output is so much higher. It's still kind of getting messed up by the fact it's being split between here, so this might actually be a situation where we do want to have a priority based on the input warehouse to make this work correctly. So we don't need to have this here, but we do need to send a signal up, and let's just make it a green signal because we can. Where this jumps across, and that will have our status of the ingot warehouse. Although, because it's being pulled from both sides, we probably can't control the belt. We'll have to control the inserters, which is doubly tricky because they're being controlled in a different way. So because they are sharing belts, it means that we will have to give them their own unique belts if we want the logic to be different. Because if we shut off this belt, it will shut it off to both regular steel and to silicon. Where if we shut this one off, it'll shut it off to manganese and then the cobalt. Which honestly is probably fine. It's a little less ideal to do it this way, but I would have to pick these machines up and move them over a few spaces in order to make room for all the belts. And I kind of don't want to do that. So if we do it this way instead, we can get this set up. So which one would have priority? Well, the one that would always run would be the side with the manganese here. So in fact, it wouldn't need any on signal at all. We would just make this one requires that the steel be at least 500. So now as these run, we can follow the signal. And sort of like before, the limit isn't working because the output speed right here is the same as the belt. So this logic doesn't quite work. But it would if we had blue belts. So knowing that, the super direct solution is just to have a priority on this splitter to make sure that it happens correctly. But that's a slightly dirtier way of doing it. But nonetheless, this is a situation where having blue belts would help the logic a bit. But this accomplishes the same thing. We really don't want to be using the steel ingots using the direct method when this can run also at full speed and be a better use of our resources. That train is complaining about not enough resources being available, but that actually makes sense because they're not at the minimum level for the train to run. So we'll just have to let that go. And it looks like concrete is static now. And that is because no steel at all. And that makes sense because we pulled away the supply depot, which we need to add back in. Which we can do here with a priority splitter to make sure that we get it. And now that it's being supplied in there, there it goes. The steel drone is on its way, so concrete production will continue. And it looks like manganese has stopped. And also just, it's a very short path for it to go from the depot to the steel coils, but there it is. Looks like it just barely got enough before we diverted the resources. But for some reason manganese isn't going. And why is that? There's no acid. Are we really out of sulfuric acid? Yeah, we're actually out of a lot of acids, but since most of them have sulfuric as an input, I suppose that makes sense. So why is that the case? No oxygen. And there's no oxygen because it looks like there's no water in any of these. Oh. Yeah, I don't know if that's a bug or just how it works, but I forgot that when concrete gets placed, it destroys these offshore pumps. Probably from the offshore pumps mod, so that explains that. Probably should have paid a little more close attention to that, because those pumps are all over the place. Hopefully this is the last time that'll happen. But we should probably follow the shoreline for everywhere where we're trying to place it, and maybe manually place some of it, just to make sure that these pumps don't get destroyed. Unfortunately though, now we are out of concrete, so maybe we're just going to have to let it get destroyed anyway. There's a lot of pumps here. I think they're all connected again. Oxygen is going at full speed now. And hopefully it all starts up soon. But that's the end of this episode. On the next one, we're going to continue working on the plates bus, this time working on brass, bronze, and gunmetal. Thanks for watching. I'll see you later.